Welcome back to GHRD TV and this vlog documenting global human rights defense's recent trip to Geneva for the 54th United Nations Human Rights Council sessions, where we attended events from the 25th to the 28th of September. Day one started bright and early, especially as some interns were flying into Geneva that morning. First on the agenda was the interactive dialogue with the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, where state members and non-governmental organizations gave their statements on the war and human rights situation in Ukraine, expressing concern for the continued conflict and violation of the human rights. GHRD submitted the following oral statement to the interactive dialogue.
Mr. President, on behalf of Global Human Rights Defense, I want to bring attention to the occurrence of sexual violence and the use of it as a weapon of war in the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine. Since February 2022, there has been mounting evidence that Russian soldiers use rape as a weapon against male and female civilian targets. Under international humanitarian and human rights law, conflict-related sexual violence can be charged as a crime against humanity, genocide, or a war crime. The severity of the crime necessitates corresponding action to punish perpetrators and other responsible and bring justice to the survivors. Global human rights defense calls on the UN and broader international community to ensure that survivors of sexual violence receive the necessary care and support, be it access to emergency contraception, mental health support, and medical care for physical injuries or societal support to counter the shame and stigma associated with sexual violence. Through these actions and judiciary prosecutions, the world's condemnation of sexual violence will be clearly demonstrated. As such, GHRD calls on the UN and other relevant bodies to exert pressure and take actions against Russian violence and violations of human rights to ensure justice, peace, and the human rights of all. Thank you.
At the NGO side event on hate crimes against minorities, various speakers, including the Special Rapporteur on Minority Rights, spoke on the negative treatment experienced by minority groups. Later, interviews were conducted with activists from the communities of the Arab people in Ethiopia and the Hazara in Afghanistan.
Yes, my name is Humayra Rezai. I'm from the Hazara community from Afghanistan. So Hazara community are a long persecuted group of people in Afghanistan. Today, actually 25th of September, is the Hazara Genocide Memorial Day.
During the interactive dialogue with the fact-finding mission on Venezuela, the mission scrutinized the various methods employed by the Venezuelan government to suppress individuals critical of the government, and the human rights violations in the country were discussed at length. With that, we wrapped up our first day at the UN and learned a lot about the ways in which human rights are discussed, enforced, and advocated for by state and non-state actors. After a delicious meal of Indian food, we got a good night of sleep and ready for our second day. Our second day started with the biannual panel discussion on youth and human rights, focusing on young people's engagement with climate change and global environmental decision-making processes. Throughout the discussions, themes of inclusivity, transparency, diversity, and youth participation were highlighted. Then we attended the NGO side event hosted by Baha'i International Community on Human Rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Activists stressed the brutal repression and denial of the fundamental human rights of the Baha'i people, especially as this year marked the 40th anniversary of the tragic execution of 10 Baha'i women in Shiraz, Iran, for their beliefs and commitment to gender equality.
I'm Simin Fahandej. I work with the Baha'i International Community's United Nations office here in Geneva, Switzerland. And one of the issues that we follow human rights as it relates to freedom of religion or belief, and especially defending the Baha'is in Iran and other countries where they're being persecuted.
GHRD's media team also documented the protests of the persecuted minority groups in Pakistan, namely the Sindhi and the Baloch peoples. The two protests were held at the Broken Chair Monument in front of the United Nations as the two communities demanded the UN and international community's intention in exerting pressure on Pakistan to stop the grave human rights violations and abuses against these two communities. Next on the agenda was interactive dialogue on human rights in Myanmar, during which the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights presented its report on the human rights situation in Myanmar. The report presented the violations carried out by the military junta, from unlawful arrests and detentions, denial of aid, forced displacement, violence, execution, and the abuse of the Rohingya minority group. As the High Commissioner states,
We need to maintain attention to the plight of the people in Myanmar. We need to continue demanding an end to violence, unrestricted access for humanitarian actors, the release of all political prisoners. We also need to ensure that those who cross international borders are protected in line with international law, that we find ways and means that assistance is delivered to them and they get refugee protection, and we need to pursue their accountability.
The next session was the Human Rights Council's general debate on human rights situations around the world that require the Council's attention. In other words, the most pressing human rights violations. The oral statements range from the dire human rights situation of women in Afghanistan and Iran, China's repression in Hong Kong and in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region or East Turkestan, and by Azerbaijan in Nagorno-Karabakh, to the condemnation of serious war crimes in Sudan and Ukraine, and the concerning restriction of civil society and assembly rights in Nicaragua, Russia, and Belarus. We then attended the informal consultations on the draft resolution on human rights and indigenous peoples and witnessed the process of creating international documents and recommendations firsthand. Some interns then attended a side event on Indigenous peoples' rights in the 54th session of the Human Rights Council, where they heard first-hand accounts of Indigenous activists in their struggles and fights for their human rights. Additionally, some of the team attended a Baloch conference called Baloch Lives Matters to show GHRD's solidarity with our partner and to discuss further collaborations for the future. Members of the research team attended a discussion on cyberbullying against children due to technology's role in increasing traditional forms of bullying. Tensions were high at the side event on media freedom in Hong Kong as we heard the testimonies and lived experiences of journalists and civil society activists from Hong Kong, despite the Chinese delegation's presence. As the general debate continued, Dr. Ulkan Issa of the World Uyghur Congress gave his statement on behalf of global human rights defense on the situation of the Uyghur people in China, which led to the interruption by the Chinese delegate twice.
I now give the floor to Stichting Global Human Rights Defense.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Once again, I'm in this council to urge member states and the UN bodies to act on the ongoing Uyghur genocide in China. It has been all the years since the High Commissioner assessment, but we haven't...
Could you please stop? We have a point of order from the delegation of China.
Since then, many UN experts have repeatedly their concern, including CERT, CESCAR, and the CEDAW committee have also issued their concluding observation urging China to end the counter-terrorism policy legitimizing the repression. Just yesterday, UN special rapporteurs had expressed grave concern over the forced separation of the Uyghur children with expansion of the state-run boarding school and the erosion of their linguistic rights. Despite increasing number of UN documents, this council has failed to meaningfully address accountable avenues. In the meantime, Uyghurs in diaspora watching our relatives disappear one by one, receiving news about the deaths and constantly facing reprisal. Just a few days ago, we learned about Professor Rahila Dawood life imprisonment. My own brother Hushtar Isa also sentenced to life. I lost my mother in the concentration camp. In recent visit to Urumqi, Xi Jinping repeated that counter-terrorism policy, a long-term plan.
Please stop. We have another point of order from China. Please.
Xi Jinping repeated the counter-terrorism policy long-term plan. Starting this repression will not end anytime soon. We must remember to uphold the promise of never again. Thank you.
At the side event on human rights in Bahrain, testimonies from survivors of state-sponsored detention, abuse, and torture recounted their experiences with coverage as they highlighted the gravity of the human rights situation in Bahrain for civil society, journalists, and human rights defenders. The 54th session of the Human Rights Council convened its annual panel discussion on the rights of indigenous peoples, focusing on the impact of specific development projects on these rights, particularly those affecting indigenous women. UN Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, Ms. Brand Karras, lays out the goals of the panel discussion.
Examining the impact of development projects on indigenous peoples' rights, especially indigenous women. 2, sharing indigenous peoples' initiatives addressing these impacts. 3, identifying best practices. And 4, discussing measures to prevent and address the implications of development projects on indigenous peoples.
We began our last day in Geneva with an NGO side event on the impact of economic development on human rights, examining the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and its impact on the minority communities of the Uyghur and Baloch peoples as well as the Pakistani peoples themselves. The Society for Threatened Peoples held an event on human rights in China and highlighted the ongoing human rights violations against the Uyghurs and Tibetans and the increased reprisals on human rights defenders and civil society actors in China. Then we sat in on the interactive dialogue with the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples, which provides the Human Rights Council with expertise and advice on indigenous rights, with the topic of this interactive dialogue being the impact of militarization on the rights of indigenous peoples. This was then followed by an interactive dialogue with Jose Francisco Calizay, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, who mentioned the possibility of green financing being an opportunity for indigenous peoples to obtain funding to preserve their lands, knowledge, and ways of life, and to create economic opportunities to help them strengthen their indigenous identity. However, he highlighted that such green finance investments must not contribute to ongoing human rights violations, which disproportionately affect indigenous peoples. Thus concludes our time in Geneva attending the Human Rights Council sessions. We will now hear from the Global Human Rights Defense interns on their experience.
This is my first time attending the Human Rights Council. I have attended many other United Nations meetings, such as the expert mechanisms on the rights of indigenous peoples, but this one is different from MRIP. So I'm really glad that I could be here and had the opportunity to learn more about how the Vietnamese government is operating and the other state members, as well as the other side events. Because during MRIP, the side events are not inside the UN building. Most of them are outside of the UN building. So it's really difficult for us to engage properly and have a more interactive dialogue with state members, whereas right now we can engage more as a civil society organization and also as NGO and as an indigenous woman. I can share more, and it's a safer space inside the United Nations building.
I think it's that the UN is a really good forum for bringing attention to certain issues, but I can't lie that I'm a bit disappointed in the fact that there's a lot of you said this, let's fight about it, but no real action is being taken.
To be able to be at the heart of international politics here at the UN headquarters, not only to see how state members interact, but also see how other NGOs advocate for their causes. And I think most impressive to me is being able to hear very personal testimonies, either from indigenous peoples or human rights defenders and activists, get the stage at such a high level to talk about their experiences and their struggles and their causes. So
very insightful for me, because as a human rights master student, I learned a lot more in depth in the current human rights violation that is happening around the world and about the challenges to address them, the challenges of hold perpetrators accountable. So it was very, very useful for me, but also I got insight into the practical side of the operation of the council. So overall, for me, it was an invaluable experience, and I'm very grateful for that.
Throughout the meeting, I learned a lot about how to report the meeting, the procedure, how the Human Rights Council really work. And then I got to see how the state delegates make statements and how does it go with also the closure remarks. I got to see the whole procedure.
But under the GHRD UN team, I've been here for around 4 months. We attended the summer session and now we're in the fall session, and it's been a really interesting experience. So it's been extremely educational. It takes a minute to get used to the kind of bureaucracy and the processes that the UN is very used to, and their constant updating of rules and everything. But when you actually hone in on the content and focus in on what's being said at council or side events or the UPR sessions, the work being done is really important. There are definitely a lot of steps that could be taken to do more, but I think that's the main thing that's going on here.
Great. Thank you for tuning in to this blog on our activities in Geneva. We hope you have gained some insight to what we do and how we advocate for human rights, especially in the United Nations. Please stay tuned for more in-depth videos and interviews from our time in Geneva.